morning. I'm looking at all of the non-trip to Thailand people. That's who we now are. It's like we're the not Thailand group, right? Now, how many of you have ever been on a trip like that before? Okay, I've had the privilege of doing that. In fact, Donna and I, about 10 years ago, got to go to Thailand itself and different mission, different places, but some similar experiences. Got to sit down with Dustin about 3 weeks ago and talk to him about his expectations. And of course, he's been there before, so he knows some of what he's looking for. But the fact is, you never totally know, right? When you're going to go and meet somebody and meet a group of people, then you've got expectations, but you don't always know. Until you actually get there, until you experience it, you don't know what's going to happen, right? And that's really kind of what we're going to be talking about this morning. We're beginning a series called Encounters with Jesus. Well, the technical term, I found this out just yesterday as I was texting with Dustin in Thailand, is Encounters with Christ. But the sermon today is Encounters with Jesus, or an encounter with Jesus, because I get to kick it off, and he gave me the privilege. I approved it with him first, but he gave me the privilege of picking the one that was going to start everything, and it's one of my favorite passages where a man actually had that first encounter with Jesus, and you could tell he had expectations. He knew what he was thinking was going to happen, but until you're actually in the situation, you don't really know. It doesn't always turn out the way you thought it was going to be. And in this case, he found that there were some things that were not quite what he thought. I want you to think about, hopefully, many of you have had encounters with Jesus. That first encounter, for example, the first time when you and the Lord meet. Now, the Lord has always known about you, but that doesn't mean you've always known about him. So the first time you actually become aware of him, where you actually become aware that this is a real person, not a historical figure, not a spiritual entity, but a real person who's interacting with you. And if you haven't had that experience, then I encourage you to be open to it, because he's looking for you and he is going to find you and he is going to pull you into that. But he won't do it if you're not open to it. We all have these kinds of experiences. A lot of times an encounter is kind of when it's like a life-changing event. It's a life-changing situation. It's a time where we realize we really need something. And we walk away from the encounter different than when we walked into it. This morning I want to share a passage with you. We're going to be in Mark 9, by the way, if you want to go ahead and turn to that. There'll be a few other passages that we look at very briefly, but Mark 9 that's where we're going to live this morning for the most part. And in Mark 9, starting in the 14th verse, Jesus he's doing his thing, but there's a person he's going to encounter. Now, I got to be honest with you. When I read these stories, for the most part, I don't think of it from Jesus' perspective. There's just something in my head where it's hard for me to get into the role of Jesus himself. So I tend to look at it from the perspective of the people who are meeting Jesus. And in this case, very much so. And the interesting thing is, we don't know who this guy is. The guy who's going to meet Jesus in Mark 9, we don't know his name. We're never told his name. We're told a little bit about him, just enough to understand the story. And we're going to see that. And beyond that, we just don't know. So as we enter into this, I want you to be open to kind of put yourself in the position of this person. Now we're going to start off in the 14th verse. And in the 14th verse, obviously, it's 13 verses that have already gone before, plus 8 more chapters. So it's not like we're starting from scratch. And if you read backwards, and I encourage you, whenever one of us is up here teaching, always make a note of that, and then go home and just spend a little bit of time, read back a little bit, read forward a little bit, put everything in context. Because unless we read from the very beginning of Genesis to the end of the Revelation every single time we're up here, then obviously we're taking things out of context, right? Because we're picking up a portion of it and dealing with that. And one of the things you're going to find is that there's an amazing context that's not even mentioned if you just start in verse 14. And that is what we call the transfiguration. Anybody ever hear of the transfiguration before? It's called the transfiguration because in the story of the transfiguration, Jesus pulls the inner circle. That's Peter, James, and John. And he pulls them aside from the rest of the 12 and the rest of the 120 and the rest of the mob that has been following him. And he takes them aside for a very specific training, if you will. And in this case, he gives them an experience that had to really pump them up, because in this experience, all of a sudden appears Elijah and Moses. And they're talking with Jesus, and Jesus, his garments all of a sudden turn super white. Whiter, it says, than any washing could ever make it. Whiter than you can imagine a fabric being. It's like the kind of burn your eyes white. And that's what's happening. And that's why they say Jesus was transfigured. My guess is it was more the way they saw him than the way he was. And he's talking to Elijah, who is the representative of all of the Old Testament prophets in the mind of the Hebrews. And then he's talking to Moses, who is the representative of the law in the mind of the Hebrews, okay? And it's like he's having this conference with his cabinet. And at the end of it, a voice to Peter and James and John, it says, "This is my beloved son. Listen to him." Now, they have this in their minds, and they immediately return. We don't know how far it was. It wasn't too far, apparently, because they walked. And they return to where the rest of the disciples are. And when they find them, there's already a situation going on. So we pick that up in Mark 9:14. When they came to the other disciples, by the way, what does that word mean? Disciples. Followers? See, in the modern church, we've kind of come to see the word disciple almost as like this other level of Christian. And in the Bible, disciple equals Christian. Same thing. In fact, the word disciple is the Greek word mathetes, still used in Greece today. If you go to school, you are a mathete, you're a student. And they call them followers because the way they taught was rabbis would literally lead them around the community and teach as they bumped into different situations, just like Jesus did. So if we follow Jesus, are automatically disciples. You cannot be Christian and not be a disciple. A disciple is not a special level. Now, you can be a bad disciple, or you can be a good disciple. But if we follow Jesus, we are disciples. And they saw a large crowd around them and the teachers of the law arguing with them. As soon as all the people saw Jesus, they were overwhelmed with wonder and ran to greet him. We don't know what that part is about. Why were they overwhelmed? I personally have to believe it's maybe this the carryover from this experience that they had just had. But it doesn't say. Jesus says, "What are you arguing about?" And a man in the crowd answered, "Teacher," Hebrew word is rabbi, "I brought you my son, who's possessed by a spirit that's robbed him of speech. And whenever it seizes him, it throws him into the ground. He foams at the mouth, he gnashes his teeth, and he becomes rigid. And I asked your disciples to drive out the spirit, but they couldn't do it." So here's this guy, this unnamed father, this man who's in anguish. You guys who are parents, have you ever experienced your kids suffering? and you can't do anything about it. It is one of the most helpless and amazingly devastating experiences you can have. Because you want to make it better for them. That's who you're supposed to be. And the only thing he could think to do was to bring him to Jesus. But he brings him to the disciples, and the disciples can't help. And what is Jesus' response to this? It's an amazing response. He just exclaimed, "Oh, unbelieving generation." Now, I don't know if I put enough frustration into it, because as I read this, I think that's what he's got. I think he's just seriously frustrated right now. Not with the guy who brought his son, not with the crowd, but with his own followers. How long shall I stay with you? How long shall I put up with you? Now, if you read back a little bit, like I was just suggesting, you're going to find he's also just started talking to them about the fact that he's going to die and be raised again. So when he asks a question like this, it's not out of the blue. And they're probably hearing this connection. And then he says, "Bring the boy to me." And so they brought him, and when the spirit saw Jesus, spirit small s, the one that was in the boy, it immediately threw the boy into a convulsion. He fell to the ground, he rolled around, foaming at the mouth. And Jesus asked the boy's father, "How long has he been like this?" "From childhood," he answered. "It's often thrown him into fire or water to kill him. But if you can do anything, please take pity and help us." "If you can," said Jesus. "Everything is possible for him who believes." Immediately the boy's father exclaimed, "I do believe, but help me overcome my unbelief." Can we live there for a moment? Is there anybody here that's experienced that? I do believe. Literally, I am believing. Ongoing, it's there, and it keeps happening. But help me overcome my unbelief. And the word unbelief is the same one that describes a few verses earlier when he says, "You unbelieving generation." It literally means not belief or not faith. Just the letter A in front of the same word. So the guy says, "I believe, but help me with not believing." Can you relate to that? Because I got to tell you, that's like my life verse. I believe. I've believed for 52 years now, but I can't count how many times I've had to come to the Lord and say, "Help me with my not belief." Well, Jesus got very frustrated the last time that word was used. But look what he does this time. When Jesus saw that a crowd was running to the scene, he rebuked the evil spirit. "You deaf and mute spirit," he said, "I command you, come out of him and never enter him again." The spirit shrieked, convulsed the boy violently, and came out. And the boy looked so much like a corpse, many said, "He's dead." But Jesus took him by the hand, and he lifted him to his feet, and he stood up. After Jesus had gone indoors, his disciples asked him privately, "Why couldn't we drive it out?" And he replied, "This kind can't come out only by prayer. This kind can only come out by prayer." In other words, this kind you're not going to be able to do unless you come to me first. Now, what are we talking about? Do we really know what this word believe means? It's a huge word. Think, for example, about this passage in Ephesians 2:8. "It is by grace that you have been saved through faith, and this not from yourselves, it is a gift from God." Well, the word faith there is the Greek word pistis. That is the New Testament word for faith and for belief. It's the same word. So when we see in the Bible the word believe and we see in the Bible the word faith, that's an English translator's decision to put one word or the other by context. But in the New Testament, it's the same word. In fact, when you see the word trust, most of the time it's the same word. When you see the word faithfulness, same word. And when you see the word unbelief or lack of faith, it's the same word with the negation in front of it, that prefix of alpha, what we would say A, not faith. It's a huge word. It's a word that means an amazing amount of things, and we've got to get hold of this because we're so used, and by the way, they did this in the New Testament time too. We're so used to seeing a part of it and thinking of the part as the whole. Think of it this way. How many of you have seen a tree before? Yes, stupid question, I know. How many of you have seen the root system of a tree? Okay? So, or at least just roots. You've seen tree roots, right? Okay, if I pointed to that and said, look, it's tree, you would know that what I mean is it's part of the tree, but not the whole thing. You'd know that the roots are not everything, right? Because if it was only the roots, then it would be dead. But what if I point to the trunk? For years, I heated my house with wood and spent a lot of times, I would dream about cutting wood. And the perfect trunks, cutting them into the perfect sizes, splitting the wood, you know. So if I pointed to the trunk and I said, see, tree, if you saw it, you would know I meant it's part of a tree, but not the whole thing. Because what does trunk mean? It means fire. It means we're going to burn it. Because it's only part of it. And when it's separated from the rest of it, it's dead. What about the leaves? The limbs, the fruit, all of that stuff that comes out of the trunk. It's still tree, right? But if I have a branch, and that branch is cut off from the trunk and cut off from the roots, what's going to happen to that branch? It's going to die. Tree is all of it. That's how God made it. Think of this word that way. There's several parts to it. For example, it means belief. Now, I'm using that word belief as when we accept that a specific thing is true. I believe Jesus is God who became flesh. Now, that's a statement, and I can say, yes, I think that's true. Based on John 1, I think that's true. But is that all of belief? Is that all of faith? In James 1:19, we run into this. People already, this is like 40, 50 AD, people already separating part of faith, part of belief, as though it was the whole thing. And James says, you believe that there's one God? Well, good. Even the demons believe that, and they shudder in fear. So when somebody today comes to the point of saying, hey, I need to tell you, I now believe in Jesus. I believe Jesus is God's son. Great, fantastic. You just raised your faith to the level of a demon. That's what James said. And by the way, the demons and Satan himself, they have no doubt about that. We struggle with it sometimes. We have doubts, but they don't. Their belief in that sense is unshakable, but it's not faith. because it's only a little part. See, the word pistis, the word faith, the word belief goes beyond just acknowledging truth. For example, it also means trust. You see that in that Ephesians passage we just talked about, but Jesus spells it out. In John 14:1, Jesus is preparing his disciples, that inner circle, because he is now just hours away from making the sacrifice of his own life. And he's trying to prepare them for it, and they are freaking out. And he says to them, don't let your hearts be troubled. Trust in God. Now, in their minds, God means the Father. Trust also in me. And it's the exact same word. You believe in who I am, but now you need to trust me. You need to rely on me. You need to be willing to put your life on this basis. It's kind of like stepping out on something, and if you ever stepped out on a rickety bridge and you kind of wondered, am I going to stay up? Or am I going to be having this trip down? And when you put your foot on it, you're trusting that it's going to hold your weight. You're trusting that you're going to be okay. When you trust somebody in this sense, when you trust Jesus in this sense, you're relying on him. And if he doesn't come through, you're in trouble. And you know that. And maybe that's one of the reasons trust is so hard for us. But it's also faithfulness. See, this word means to believe something is true, but it also means to trust based on what you believe is true. And when you believe something is true and when you trust, then you act differently. So in Galatians 5:22, this is the fruit of the Spirit, Paul lists the fruit of the Spirit. And he says the fruit of the Spirit is love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness. Faithfulness. Did you catch it? It's exactly the same word. So when this man says to Jesus, I believe, he's not just saying, look, Jesus, I believe you're something different. I believe you're special. I believe you can help my son. No, he's saying this whole three-dimensional faith. I accept the truth about who you are. And I trust you. And I'm going to act on that trust. But help me with my lack of all of that. I believe. But help me with my not belief. And when I read that, I'm just flooded with memories of how many times I've had to come to the Lord and say, Lord, I just don't have it. I don't believe enough. My faith isn't good enough. It's not strong enough. But what did Jesus do? When his own disciples, who should have been at a different level, did not trust him, did not come to him, he responded in frustration. But when this man did come to him, when this man did say, oh, Lord, my faith isn't where it should be, and I know that, and I need your help. Jesus didn't turn his back on him. Jesus didn't respond in frustration. He didn't say anything to this guy about being part of an unbelieving generation. No, he did exactly what the guy asked him to do. He honored the faith that he had and helped him with the faith that he didn't have. It's an amazing story. And there's several things that we can learn from this particular encounter. First of all, we can learn that faith is not all or nothing. So often we think we either believe or we don't. You either have faith or you don't. You either trust Jesus or you don't. And that's almost never true. And if you think about it in your own experience, you probably can see that that's just not real. That's not human. And while we wish we could be stronger, while we wish we could be more faithful, God isn't expecting that of us. God is ready to help us. And all we have to do is, like this guy, say, I need help. I believe, but I need help with not believing. And Jesus is standing there ready. See, we think Jesus, sometimes we think he's just waiting for a chance to nail us. It's an amazing thing that we do because we can accept the basics of the gospel, in theory at least, but then we act like if we just get out of line a little bit, Jesus is going to be so ticked off at us, he's going to be so upset at us that he's going to nail us. Folks, Jesus did not give his life for you so that he could find the very first thing that you lack and jump on it to judge you. Jesus gave his life for you so that he could have that encounter and from that point forward supply what's lacking and constantly build your faith. And yes, as your faith gets stronger, you will run into other situations where you need even more help. And he'll be there for you. So faith is not all or nothing. Faith is easy right up until you need it. Have you found that out? I'm always a little bit amused at some of the things in the New Testament because of how different their life is from our life, that we miss some things. For example, you've heard the Lord's Prayer, right? Jesus is teaching us not, recite these words like it's a magic formula, but pray like this. And one of the things that he does is teach us to pray for our daily needs. And the phrase that he uses is, give us today our daily bread. In other words, give me what I need to eat today. I need you. I need to rely on you, Lord, to give me what I need today. And we pray that. How many of you prayed that? How many of you had a freezer full of food when you prayed that? See, it's real easy to say, give me what I need to eat today when we've got like 2 months worth of supplies. But if you've ever been in a situation where you didn't have 2 months worth, where you literally had to say, Lord, I don't have anything, then all of a sudden faith isn't as easy as it was. It's easy to say, Lord, help me with my kids. I love my kids. I want to raise them in you, and I want to be faithful in how I do that. When we're capable of doing everything that we want to do. But when we run into a situation where we can't take care of it anymore, maybe it's their health. Maybe it's a decision that they're making. When we run into that situation, all of a sudden, it's a whole different bag. See, faith is real easy right up until you need it. And then faith isn't so easy anymore. And it doesn't mean that the faith that we've had has been unreal. It just means that now we need to move to a different level. And almost every time that happens, we're going to find ourselves saying with this guy, Lord, I believe, but help me in my unbelief. And that's going to be a different kind of situation for every one of us because we each struggle with different things. Some of us, certain things, no problem at all. There are things that I don't struggle with at all. Some of you would encounter them and it would freak you out. But some of you who might be freaked out by that encounter the things that freak me out and you don't have a problem with it. See, every one of us has a different profile, so to speak, of faith. Jesus understands that, and he's ready. He's there to help us. Weak faith needs Jesus' help. Now, weak faith can benefit from help from other believers. It's a good thing to be with other believers. It's a good thing to gather together like this, to encourage each other. It's a good thing to sit down with someone and pray with them. It's a good thing to say, I'm struggling with this. And Jesus can use us to strengthen each other. But the bottom line is there's going to be times, because our faith isn't in each other. Our faith is in him. There's going to be times when our faith is weak enough that we need him. I think he set it up that way because it draws us to him. And that's what our faith is about, is that personal interaction, that relationship with Jesus himself. So weak faith is going to be there for us, and it needs Jesus' help. And the good news is Jesus does not turn his back on us when we run into that. And we are commanded to have faith. We're commanded to believe. But we can't have that faith all on our own. It's kind of an interesting thing if you look at that passage we read in Galatians, the fruit of the Spirit. There's all these things. Now, fruit of the Spirit means the Spirit grows the fruit, right? But every single one of those things is something we are commanded to do somewhere else. We're commanded to love in the most extraordinary circumstances, to love. But we can't love without Jesus. We can't love on our own. We're not going to be able to pull it off. And being faithful, having the faith, that belief and trust and faithfulness all wrapped up together, we're not going to pull that off on our own. It's just not going to happen. Now, before we leave, I want to briefly look at why then do we not believe? I mean, as I look at you, as I'm saying these things, most of you, you're pretty serious. But there's a lot of nodding going on. So I don't think I'm saying things that are entirely foreign to you. I don't think this is totally news to you. So if that's the case, then why don't we believe? I think there's a lot of reasons, but I've got just 4 that I want to draw attention to. The first one, I'm going to just be really blunt. I think it's ignorance. You see, our faith it begins with what we accept as real. Does God exist? There's a lot of people around you who will believe that you're an idiot for thinking that God exists. In fact, in this country today, that's now becoming the dominant belief. Didn't used to be that way. Now, we're still in the Bible Belt here, but I got to tell you something. We moved 5 years ago, and for you native Texans, I apologize on behalf of all the invaders, but we moved 5 years ago from California. We are not Californians and never have been. Please do not put that label on us. But we did move here from California. I served at church for 17 years in Orange County, California. And I got to tell you, it is hard to be Christian there. Because the world is so strong in taking on Christian beliefs and saying, no, they're wrong. And it's so easy, just because of the constant barrage, for Christian people to not do their homework and to accept the world's assessment, to accept the values of the world. My ministry is focused on family ministry, for most of the years that I was in ministry. Counseling, support groups, family enrichment, and things like that. One of the things that's always impressed me is how Christians tend to simply accept the assessment of the world. Even when I was growing up, the assumption was that we would be sexually active before we're married. And the idea that you would wait until after you're married in order to be sexually active was not only unusual, but mocked. Today, if you say publicly, no, I've made the decision, I'm not going to do that until I'm married, you will be ridiculed right into the ground. Even though even secular research says that approach is far healthier for you and far healthier for your marriage. See, a lot of us simply buy into the ignorance of the world around us because the world says it so often, and we just give up and accept it. We need to know what the Word says. And if we have some issue in believing whether or not it's true, we need to ask the question. Christians never need to worry about truth. We serve the truth. So when we start doing the research, we're going to find out the truth supports what he says. So one of the problems we have with faith is our own ignorance. One of the problems we have with faith is distrust. I'm not going to ask you to raise your hand on this one because I don't need to. I'm going to just say, I don't think there's probably anybody sitting here, short of the little baby, that if I said, have you ever been burned by somebody? Have you ever been given reason to distrust? You'd raise your hand. We have. We've been hurt. I served the church for 50 years, and I've been burned by every church I've ever served. I've been hurt. You know why? Because the people in the church are people like me. The first qualification to be in the church is what? Got to be a sinner. If you're not a sinner, you don't qualify. So we have this relationship with a bunch of sinners, and guess what? We're going to hurt each other because that's what sinners do. I've even been hurt by Jesus. I've never been harmed by him, by the way. See, there's a big difference. Parents, have you ever hurt your children? If you haven't, you're probably not doing a very good job. And your children will say, oh, they'll give you a list. But see, that's not the same as harming them. If you're so afraid not to hurt them in any way, you're going to harm them. See, we take a long-term view. There's a song, I don't know what it is. I heard it as we were visiting different churches. It's part of the ministry that I oversee. And the last phrase of this song was, I fear what you might allow. And I was devastated because that was, bam, that is me. I don't fear God's faithfulness. I know he's faithful. But I do fear what he might allow sometimes. Because he's going to allow whatever is needed in order to produce righteousness and peace in me. That's what Hebrews says. And I got to tell you, there's a lot of stuff that fits that characterization that I don't want any part of. I don't want to be disciplined by God. There's times I'm saying, Lord, I think I've grown enough for now. Can we just take time out? And his response is, no. We have to be willing to trust God. We have to be willing to take that step that says, I will allow God to do anything in my life that he wants to do, and I will assume that because he knows what I don't, and because he is love itself, that when he does something in my life, no matter how much it hurts, that's what's best for me. That's hard to do. Every one of us struggles with that. Sometimes we don't have faith because of pride. Sometimes we're in the same situation as this father was, and we simply say, I don't want to admit it. Now, we're not going to say that. We're going to feel it, and we're going to act on it. What would have happened in that story if that father had not admitted his lack of faith? Well, I guess we don't know. But based on what happened when he did, my guess would be it would be a whole different ending. Sometimes our pride is so strong, we don't even want to admit to God himself that we're weak. Like somehow he doesn't know. And the reality is, he knows it before you figure it out. So we've got to be willing to get past the pride. I'm going to ask the worship team to come up and prepare to lead us as I share the last of the why don't we believe. And I think this is one that we've got to be willing to submit to God and say, Lord, if there's something like this that I'm not even seeing, I need your help. I need you to show it to me. Because sometimes we don't have faith because we have a preference for sin. Sometimes we don't believe. Sometimes we don't trust. Sometimes we're not faithful to God because, pure and simple, we'd rather sin. We've established a lifestyle we're quite comfortable with, and we don't want to give it up. We have a particular sin in our life that we know if we make Jesus truly Lord of our life, he's going to say, that's got to change. We don't want that. There are things that we value because of sin in our life, and there's almost no sin that I can think of that doesn't have a payoff. Let's be real. If it didn't have something that we got out of it, we wouldn't do it. There is a payoff to sin. But it's not a good payoff. And we've got to realize that when we decide that we're going to sin, when we decide we're going to do this lifestyle, when we decide this behavior is more important, that we're giving up faith. See, here's the thing about these three aspects of faith: belief and trust and faithfulness. They build on each other. This week, all of us will have the opportunity for encounters with Jesus. Now, I did this air quotes thing because the reality is he's here with us right now. It's not like he's out there waiting and surprise, here he is. He's here all the time. But we're going to run into situations where we're not thinking, where we're not aware of his presence until we get into it. And then all of a sudden it's going to be, and we're going to have a choice. Are we going to respond in faith? For some of us, we're going to need to say, help me in my lack of belief in truth. Help me to see what's real. For some of us, it's going to be, Lord, help me to trust you. For some of us, it's going to be, Lord, help me to live faithfully. The word belief, the word faith in Scripture is all of that in one package, like the tree. It's not one or the other. And we can't do that on our own. Our faith will grow. Our relationship with Jesus will grow. And Jesus is so committed to you and to me that he is ready constantly to help us with these things. But he's waiting, because part of this is he wants us to want that. I'm going to ask you to pray with me. And as we pray, I want you to think about what your week is going to be like. I don't know what it's going to be. But I want you to think about those situations where you may encounter the need for his help, for him to give you the help with the not faith. And I want you to make a commitment. Make it to him, make it to yourself, that you'll turn to him when that happens. Our Lord, we are so grateful. I'm grateful for this story, Lord, for seeing some guy who is like me, whose faith is incomplete, whose faith is not perfect. Because, Lord, that is me. I know I need help in every aspect of my faith. And I know you're the only one that can give it to me. So I pray, Lord, that in whatever situation that I encounter, that you would give me faith, that you would help me with my not faith. And I pray, Lord, for each person here, that we as a body would grow in our faith, in our belief, in our trust, in our faithfulness, that we would please you and that our relationship with you would deepen. We know that this can happen, Lord, because it's based in your faithfulness, not ours. We thank you for this in Jesus' name.